in other words, Australia is just a bloody desert, and this has a lot of land, and it does make sense to specialise in products that use a lot of land. And it should import the rest. By the way, these two guys, they were worried about the mass migration that happened in the early 20th century from many European countries to the US. And so they were worried that you have all of these poor peasants, Swedish peasants, that were leaving to the US. And Orling basically said, no, that's not going to happen. And he ended up by developing the factor proportions theory that we'll look at today and next week. So here's the setting. Now, as you saw, and I asked you to have a look at the slides, there's quite a lot of notation, and there are lots of mathematical expressions, but they're really this very simple stuff that you were taught in your first year of micro. So this idea that firms maximize profits or firms minimize costs. So it should all be very simple, and I'll end up by spending a lot of time just looking at diagrams and kind of explaining what they mean. So this is the setting. So 2 countries, 2 goods, 2 factor model, home, foreign, cloth and food, labour and T for terre, terrain, and then you can go from this to capital as being another factor. Yeah? So as always, you don't need to take these 2 factors as being the truth, that the only two inputs that cloth and food really needs is labour and land. We're just saying it's going to be an amalgamation of stuff, and we're ignoring the fact that yes, you will need a bit of physical capital, you will need some tools, yeah? So it may well be that that T, that terre, is actually the land you need plus the capital goods, yeah? The crucial thing is just make sure you just have 2. And they're paid wages, W and rent, so nominal wages and rents R, and so this R is then going to be useful because it's also the rental price of capital. So if you approach this with labour and capital, the W and the R will remain as the 2 prices of your factors of production. And as you can see, we end up by, from the outset, ruling out the sort of reason for trade that was the focus on Ricardian trade theory, because we assume they have access to the same technology. So if you go back to Ricardian trade theory, the reason why Germany was so much productive than China at producing all of those goods, of course, is because Germany was using a production technology that was totally different. For one thing, it was going to be much more mechanized than the Chinese production technology. And here we're saying that cannot be a reason for trade, because we assume that there are, in these 2 sectors, the 2 countries can have access to exactly the same production technology. Yeah? So from the outset, we rule out differences in productivity due to different technologies as being the key reason for trade. Yeah? And to simplify, initially, you have a static approach, so you don't have economic growth, so technology is fixed. Yeah? So there's a certain capital, there's a certain land, there's a certain labour, and they're just going to be combined to producing the 2 goods under constant returns to scale. Yeah? So again, this, for those of you that don't like constant returns to scale, it's a very natural assumption. If I'm really just saying that all I need to produce cloth is land and labour, so terre and T and L, then if I double my acres of land and I also double the workers, I should be able to produce double output. And that's exactly what constant returns to scale says. And this should be should happen while I have diminishing returns to each factor independently. So standard assumptions, you have constant returns to scale but diminishing marginal products. If I keep on adding workers to the same plot of land, yes, I will produce more output, more food, but at ever smaller rates. Yeah? So, perfect competition, as with Ricardian trade theory. So firms are small, producers are small, so are workers, and so they take all of these prices as given, the prices of the two final goods, cloth and food, and the prices of factors of production, W and R, as given. No transportation costs, and preferences, we're going to assume they're the same across countries. Again, this is because you want to rule out another reason for trade. If you have home and foreign, and yes, you have cloth and food, but home people just have an enormous preference towards food, whereas foreign has an enormous preference towards cloth, then it's natural that home would be specializing in that product. So we rule out that possibility again by saying, if they're going to trade, it's not because one country has this enormous desire to consume a certain product, whereas the other one does not. Yeah, so they have the same preferences. Now, are you happy with this notation? So quantities of the output, the final product, CNF, the Qs, the relative corresponding prices of those final products, PC and PF, the prices of the factors of production, W and R, and then you have a certain amount of labour in each at home that is allocated between the cloth sector and the food sector, and the same thing for T for land. Yeah? And this is basic micro stuff. I'm a small firm. I want to minimize my cost of production. I'm going to do that subject to an isoquant. So if I want to produce Q bar units, and I know that I produce it using this technology F that requires T and L, then I'm going to want to minimize this, my total cost. So I use T units, each one costs R. I use L units, each one costs W. I will want to minimize this total cost subject to producing that quantity Q bar. Yeah? So graphically, and this is what I'm going to focus on, you just get a nice tangency condition. All of you know this. The marginal rate of technical substitution should be equal to the ratio of prices. That's what you have in here. Yeah? That's all right? So this comes, as you can see, directly from the minimization. So those of you that cannot see how you go from this to that, if you want, you could obviously write a Lagrangian, not that you need to, write a Lagrange constraint here, and you would get immediately this condition, yeah? So when you minimize your cost, you get this, yeah? So I want to produce that quantity Q bar. I take the prices of the factors W and R as a given. So let me go down the isoquant so that at the optimum there is a tangency between my marginal rate of substitution and the ratio of prices. And any point anywhere else there would be a possibility to do better, to reduce your costs by shifting towards the factor of production that is relatively cheaper. Yeah? So this is basic cost minimization. By the way, as you can see, this is an isocost, so it's just a line. That's why you have a line. As you can see, the T was on the vertical axis, and the L was on the horizontal axis. So WR, or to be more specific, minus W over R was indeed the slope of the line. And the slope of the isoquant is nothing but this, the marginal rate of technical substitution. So saying that this slope is equal to that slope is indeed just saying this, what we have in equation 1. And here's an example. So Cobb-Douglas, you have, you use T and L. The alphas, for those of you that did growth and development or intermediate macro, you will remember that this, in competitive and economy is also the share of income that is paid to the factor T. So if alpha is equal to a third, it means that 1/3 of national income is paid to the factor land, 2/3 will be to labour. If alpha is equal to 2/3, it would be the other way around. And as you can see, when we try to compute that cost minimization condition, what we get is marginal product of land T, marginal product of labour, as both depending only on the land-labour ratio. Yeah? And this equation 4 is nothing but the equation 1, where I substituted the MPT and over MPL by the expressions we have on the right-hand side of equations 2 and 3. And as you can see, this should not be too surprising, and we'll get a figure showing this. A high wage, relative wage, so relative wage is going to be a high W over R, is going to be positively related to the relative use of land. Logic, firms are trying to minimize their costs. Every time the wage increases relative to the price of the other factor, so every time this on the left-hand side goes up, it makes sense to move away from the factor of production that has become more expensive. So you move away from labour, because labour is now more expensive, and you move towards land. If you move away from labour and move towards land, towards T, that T of L is going to increase. Yeah? So as you can see, this expression 4 is nothing but a condition for cost minimization. If I'm a profit maximizing firm and I try to produce any given quantity of output in any sector by minimizing my costs, then there's going to be a positive relation between the relative wage and my relative use of the other factor, in this case, land. Yeah? Is this all right, everyone? And so here's the diagram. And so, by the way, of course, again, it doesn't make any sense to think about these extremes, but just for the point of explaining the diagrams, if the wage were to be equal to 0, doesn't make any sense, but if labour were free, then as you can see, the T would also be equal to 0. If it's free to use workers, no one would want to use land. You would try, even though it might be very difficult, you would try to produce agricultural products just with workers. Yeah? So don't take this too seriously. So try to imagine food produced without land. This is what we're going to get in the next 20 or 30 years. So we will be eating meat that was produced in a laboratory. Yeah? That doesn't need any of the tea. Okay, so figures 2 and 3 are just, of course, illustrating this substitution. And I'll come back to this diagram, but this is effectively how it works. You start off with a certain use of labour and land for a given relative wage. When the relative wage increases, you are still trying to produce that quantity Q bar, but of course you move away from labour because it has become relatively more expensive, and you move towards land because it's relatively cheaper. So it's basic substitution, and that's what's reflected in that relation. A high W means a high land to labour ratio. Is this all right, everyone? So cost minimization should give us that sort of relation. So this is just replicating the previous diagram, figure 2, but now illustrating this on on a diagram that has the wage, relative wage, and the relative use of land. And this is just picking those 2 points. So this point here is that point there. So it's saying if the W over R happens to be reasonably low, I'm using a reasonable amount of labour, so the T over L is going to be small. However, if the wage relative to the rental price of land increases substantially from this value to that value, I will try to save on the use of labour, and so I will be using a lot more T over L. Yeah? So that's what you have in here, and I'm going to, for the purposes of illustration, I'm going to use